There is an interesting long-form discussion over the last couple of days, I think it's yesterday, on the psychology of settler colonialism, or the psychology of the colonizers, to be precise and more useful, and Israel. Well, they play down Israel's traumatic history where I'd not, and thereby attach Israel to European settler colonialism, and they might look the same. Zionism was a badly done, almost romantic notion, but the Jews had been persecuted, marginalized, and at last butchered since before Jesus, where England, France, Spain, and Portugal were not, but in fact were the butchers of Jews as often as possible. I know there has been some retrieval since the Americas were colonized. Flee us from persecution. Mon Dieu, what a persecuting lot the Europeans were in the 17th and 18th century. I would most definitely have fled too. But they were not ancestral homelands, were they? No one was returning to the Americas. Within these religions, there might be a built-in sense of persecution that might have driven Englishmen across the Atlantic to make their New Jerusalem. I can totally understand that. As an outsider to the faiths, I can't or shouldn't comment except that those within them, within the faiths, are incapable of examining them. It is the nature of faith. They, I think it's Dr. Lara Sheehy and Rania Khalek, who were discussing this, super smart, speak in words I understand, but take us a bit off track. For instance, when did it begin and why settler colonialism? The main big one began in Spain in 1492 and had a hodgepodge of motives, some real, most invented, all advertised. It seems that the first advertising target was God, the Christian God, or rather, to be fair, the motive of wealth and spreading Christianity forged a long-lived and incredibly effective partnership under Ferdinand and Isabella. Wealth becomes holy almost. And it's interesting that there were clearly people who were just straight out greedy, and they wanted to find gold, they wanted to find El Dorado in the New World. And the fusion of that with God, with their notion of God, to whom it seems that they prayed and also imagined that their real motives, their greed, would be concealed somehow from their God, is just too interesting to explore. Or rather, to be fair, the motive of wealth and spreading Christianity forged a long-lived and incredibly effective partnership under Ferdinand and Isabella. Wealth becomes holy almost. See today, everywhere around you. Edward Bernays would have been impressed or even jealous. But both motives seem universal. The Arab conquests 800 years before Columbus were not settler colonial. They were more Persian or Roman. Come, see, conquer, then home. The Spanish weren't exterminated by the Arabs. Their language and religion were not rubbed out. They might have been oppressed a little bit, but they weren't made invisible. That is what happened in the Americas and Australias. You gotta just fess up. Islam had not grown out of a Christian world. In the lands of the most ancient of peoples, they had grown out of the desert. So Christians proscribed Muslims like they were heretics. Well, they were to Christians. Christians proscribed everyone as heretics, not themselves, even some of themselves. See Catholics and Protestants, despite their claims to a universal love. Paragraph, there's a thing particularly irritating about Christians' claims of what Jesus brought to the human race, because the reality is it is often someone speaking like Dr. King and behaving like Adolf Hitler. Close paragraph. The Crusades were not colonial, yet they were, for annihilation purposes, between equals, with Europe most definitely claiming a right to land they had no right to, except their prophet left footprints and died there, a premise to be expanded upon. So maybe settler colonialism was in the cradle then. The New Jerusalem, New World romances are now pretty arid, thank God. Thank the gods, thankfully. But the fantasies, the warm places inside remain and have such clout as they are repeated over and over again by the simpletons we elect to office. One of our gooier fantasists, David Brooks of the New York Times, joins the anti-Trump dander up brigade by saying he always thought of the United States as a force for good in the world. That is their fantasy. Quite extraordinary based on the evidence. Why? Except he needs that to be the case so desperately, while the Indians died. This is the United States, to mention but a generation that has incited and fought in wars since 9/11 that have killed probably 5 million people worldwide and counting, leaving the Satans du jour in China and Russia far behind. To say, like we do, that the wars were fought against terrorism gets closer than you think to Hitlerian. What is the answer? Were you honest? Well, yes, we killed all those people, but we are morally über alles. Morally superior, that's what it means. It is a lie for those who center their identity on such lies that are meaningless to the 4.7 million dead. He later claims mistakes were made. Oh, okay, Vietnam and Iraq. Not genocide and slavery, he leaves those out. He does look sillier as the days pass. The debates are really only, anyway, battles of quotes. I give you 2 Chomskys for your 1 Brooks. Then there are the 3 Madisons, but I've got 5 Jeffersons. We just don't think for ourselves in any way anymore. There had been centuries of invasions in Eurasia, but as far as I can tell, there was always a modicum of familiarity, knowledge of, and dare I say, respect between, say, Mongol and Slav. The attitudes towards the natives of the Americas, however, were unique in human history, exceptional, let's say, and started other civilizational trends driven today and before by theologians and scientists. African slavery was a breath away. These are the Brooks roots, contrasting his new bleach. Slavery gets a good old laundering these days, several cleanings, but it should be pointed out that many slaves in the ancient world were not thought inferior by their masters. Not racially. They had lost battles, which may have been a mark of inferiority in the ancient world, been drubbed by Caesar, but there's no evidence of that. None at all. The veneration or the inordinate respect that the Greeks had for the Egyptians and that Xenophon had for Cyrus the Great, Alexander had for Cyrus the Great. There's a book called the Cyropedia written by Xenophon. It'd be like an American writing a book idolizing Ho Chi Minh. Does not happen. By the time the British aristos arrived in Virginia and had died of starvation, they had the evidence but not the brains to figure out they were a pathetic, hopeless lot without their serfs. It is the nexus with African slavery. Therefore, thank you, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and bollocks to the whining descendants of Jamestown. How these idiots came up with survival of the fittest as a notion in the Western world is a study in European fantasy. Now, Israel, which was the topic today, given that the blueprint settler colonials were this clever hybrid of greed and faith, this was not the case with Zion. It just wasn't. I caveat because I'm looking from the outside, which doesn't disqualify what I say for a moment, just as Ferdinand and Isabella and their ghostly Catholic advisors will tell no truths in describing what they planned, Zionists will tell what it means to them, but will not be helpful in understanding the effects. That is the problem with religions. From the history and the myths, the Jews seem to have a very justified persecution notion, call it complex. It's all based on truths, which would make the longing for a safe and fecund homeland with plenty of relics and vellum lying around from 2,000 years ago very appealing and understandable to any of us. What is, until now, incomprehensible because it is uninvestigated is what Ferdinand, Isabella, and George III were thinking. Maybe someone can discover when white America was rounded up by Vietnamese to justify that much killing, or a treaty with the French. What happened? What changed the conquistador and their crew to the tired, the poor, the huddled masses? Or when the F are they going home to Europe? Psychologically, I think Zionism is a very understandable but awful mashup of generational trauma and generational guilt. Europe had an equally toxic mix, but it was entirely self-inflicted or faith-inflicted. No trauma to speak of except a civilization very keen on elites and their very necessary serfs, slaves, butlers, and at last, in America, underpaid employees. Since they were the winners, they wrote the history and avoided the facts. Hopefully, probably, until now. Now we have generational guilt, the challenge of the day, much harder to reconcile or to resolve. If only we could get to the admitting we can't. Very hard. It takes practice and cojones, which after watching the display of crying ministers in Europe are clearly in short supply. Halleck and Sheehy are comprehensive, much better educated than I, younger and of the region, so I recommend the watch on Breakthrough News. But my habit is always, my habit, and it has to be mine, what if it were me? In other words, as a white male, as a white European male, it is impossible for me to empathize. It has not happened to me. Many things have happened to me. And if I have been oppressed, it's been people like me who've done the oppressing. I find myself looking at multiple tragedies, except for the settler colonial, which is not a tragedy. A tragedy is something unavoidable. A change in the weather drives the hordes off the steppes into Europe. Do I think the great horse cultures evolved to charge and plunder, that they waited and prepared to burst out of Asia and terrorize feudal Europe for 160 years, important time period? And did they settle in thereafter or remain apart, not marrying the Euros? We know their threat united European warlords who, the instant the Mongols were gone, went home, they went back to butchering each other. That is a European habit for 1,000 years and should probably be examined. But again, it won't. More fantasy for Brooksy. The U.S. arms Israel and Ukraine out of their essential force for good in the world-ness. Come on. This difference between tragedy and atrocity is really important. My brother, what was her name? Anna something. This great military geopolitical historian was on a YouTube, and he sent it to me. And she made one awful mistake. She was full of aphorisms, anecdotes, which are fun, but they need to apply. She said, if you cross somebody else's border and commit atrocities in their country, it will always end badly. Well, what happened in the Americas, dear? It's that incapacity to see, and how convenient it is that it leaves us looking like angels. And it's a lie.